Hey, I'm Livia Creations, and I'm here to create. And today, we are turning this Axew figurine into this official Pokemon TCG card. So let's get right into this. Here in my hands, I have a second-hand Axew figurine. But there's something wrong with it. Obviously, the pose. The hands aren't placed exactly the same way as in the card. So I'm gonna have to change that. First, I mark down everywhere where I want to cut with a graphite pencil. Then, I very carefully, with a sharp X-Acto knife, start cutting into my figurine. The vinyl is very squishy and likes to grab onto the blade, so I try to be as careful as possible with this step as to not cut myself. Well, that was more difficult than I thought it would be. How about we do the rest of them cutaway style? Now that everything is attached, I took the time to mark the arms left and right as to not switch them around. Now it's time to bring out the big guns. I swear this won't hurt a bit. Using the smallest drill bit I own, I make holes in the body and in the limbs to be able to reconnect them later with wire. After cutting a length of jewelry wire to about the size I needed it, I made sure to shove it into the body as deep as I could with some pliers. Test fitting the head on the wire showed me that it was too long, so I trimmed it and then I was ready to pose the head using the wire. To secure and hold everything in place, I used a dot of my trusty dusty super glue. After shoving the head back onto the wire, I was ready to use a special technique involving super glue and baking soda to make sure that everything stays in place. When you add baking soda to super glue, it creates an exothermic reaction which cures the super glue very fast and also makes it more durable. I do love this technique, but it is kinda messy, so afterwards I use a brush to clean my figurine. Now that the head is secured, let's move on to the arms. For the arms, I use the same technique as for the head, using jewelry wire shoved into the body and cut down to size, and then using super glue to fill in the gaps after I pose the body to match the image. The second arm went basically the same way, I just repositioned it more towards the back of the body. This process was quite long and tedious, but I feel like it was worth it to make sure that the figurine matched the image as much as possible. Now that everything is back into place, we can finally initiate the usual customization prepping, which means taking off any labels and any registration lines. To do this, I used some carving tools as well as my trusty dusty sanding blocks. I took this opportunity to use the super glue and baking soda method to also fill in the markings on the face, because I am going to reposition them later. Now, to fill in the gaps and make it look seamless, I'm going to use some 2-part epoxy sculpt. Just mix part A and B and apply it to the figurine. For this figurine, I did 2 passes. The first one just to fill in the gaps and make sure everything is well in place, and the second one to add the details and make it seamless. For this, I really like to use my silicone sculpting tools, not only because they can get into every corner, but also because the silicone texture makes it super easy to smooth down epoxy sculpt. For the second arm, I had to reconstruct part of the belly, and this was crucial that I made it as smooth as possible because the transition would be very obvious if I didn't. While doing the last little details, I make sure to reference the card as much as possible to make it as similar as possible. And now it's time for Axew to find out if he can breathe underwater. After making sure that the figurine is all dry, we can finally prime it. I used the Army Painter primer for this. Now we can leave all of this to dry and move on to the base. So now for the base, I chose to use a non-disclosed brand of peanut butter lid as a starting point. Now, we have a very heavy tree coming up on this base. A 3-point triangle-shaped base is going to be the best for sturdiness. To do this, I make 3 holes into the base and insert 3 equal-length wires in them. I make sure to fold the end into a hook to make sure that it won't slip out. And then I use some hot glue to hold it all in place. After adding my 2 other lengths of wires, I take a smaller gauge wire and wrap it all around them to lock them together. Now it's finally time to add some aluminum foil to the base to start making the general shape of the tree. During this step, it is especially important to stay focused on the reference. Using smaller and smaller pieces of aluminum foil, I am slowly building up the general shape of the rocks. Now that the foil base is finally done, we can finally start applying some sheets of super scluptey to it. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those fancy pasta rolling machines, so I'm just using one of my wooden sculpting tools to flatten it out. Once my sheet is about 3 mm tall or about 1/4 of an inch in freedom measurements, I can apply it to the base. On this first layer, I'm not being particularly careful because I just want to cover as much foil as possible before going on to making the details. While sculpting, I found that using the wooden handle of my sculpting tools works great for making these sharp corners. Whilst always keeping an eye on my reference, I slowly build up the details with a myriad of different tools, including silicone sculpting tools and wooden sculpting tools. I'll be nice, I'll spare you the hours of work I spent to get to my finished result. Now that the sculpting part is done, we get to bake the clay. I ended up using a heat gun to bake the clay as much as possible because, flash news, you can't put plastic in the oven. I didn't think that through, did I? But it ended up working out just fine with a heat gun, so I'm super glad for that. After letting it cool all the way down, I was able to hit it with a quick coat of primer. Before getting started on the actual paint job, I decided that I would add some texture to the grass part of the base. This texture is the one that I made for my Xerneas custom, which I'm going to link down in the description below if you want to see that. But when it comes down to it, this texture is simply some white gesso, some sawdust, and a myriad of different brown paints. This paste was especially useful for filling the gaps between the polymer clay and the lid. Making sure that my paints matched the reference, I started slowly but surely painting all of the details on the sculpture. Starting off with the light areas and moving on to the shadows, which unfortunately barely show on camera. During this entire project, I constantly add a photo of the reference on my monitor to make sure that I wouldn't miss any details. And now it's time for some satisfying lining. Painting the little moss details on the rocks were so satisfying to do and truly adorable. I tried a art hack for this project, and that is to use some nail art brushes for doing some lining. And oh boy, is it a game changer. These nail art brushes are so good for doing lines. Painting the tree trunk went basically the same way, except that I started with the shadows with this one and ended with the highlights. This little slash in the tree was so satisfying to add. I find it to be such a cute little detail. Not really sure what to do with the lid, I decided to add this bumpy little detail with black paint. Whew, that was already a lot of work, but there's still a lot to do. And starting off with the leaves of the tree. I'm gonna be honest, I kinda put off making this detail until the last very second because I didn't really know how to do it. But after multiple days of consideration and multiple experiments, I decided that I would make it out of a aluminum foil base and then cover that base with some Crayola Muddle Magic. This stuff is basically a extremely lightweight air dry clay. Considering that this is very lightweight, it was probably my best option because since the leaves will be all on one side of the sculpture, I don't want them to be too heavy and have the sculpture tip over all the time. I started off with making a very quick pass over all of the foil just to seal it in, and then I left it all to dry. After letting it dry overnight, I came back the next day and decided that I would do the leaf textures by adding some balls and flattening them over the surface. After covering everything in dozens of balls, I went back with some tools and decided to make bumps and lumps and divots to mimic a cartoony leaf look. After being done with all of that, I finally mustered up the courage to line the entire base with some black paint. And of course, once again, I was referencing the card art all the way through this process. The line art is really what brings it all together for me. It really makes it look like a 3D version of the card art. Without any transition, let's move on to the greenery. I use the exact same technique to do all of the greenery. First, I draw the pattern on a piece of paper. Then I color it in. And then I cut it out and stick it to the model with some super glue. And then it's just a process of doing that again and again and again until all of the greenery that is present on the card art is present on my figurine as well. For this part, I was mostly focusing on the smaller details and making sure that I wouldn't miss any of them. Making the little blue flowers went basically the same way, except you add the step of stringing them onto a painted piece of jewelry wire. And of course, securing them with some crazy glue. I found the step of adding all of the blue flowers so therapeutic. Adding this pop of color truly brought the whole thing together in my opinion. Now that all of the flowers have been placed, I can finally paint the leaves, and that's the base done. And now for the most exciting part, painting the figurine. Now that our little Axew is all dry and prepped for painting, we can finally start. Starting off with this grayish green color, I can fill in all of the shadows on the figurine. I feel like I've said it 1,000 times by now, but once again, I make sure to look at the reference again and again to make sure that I'm placing my paint strokes correctly. Whoop, you're not supposed to see that. The shadows on the reference feature a couple different colors, so I make sure to include them into the final result. Moving on to this light beigeish kind of color, this color also almost covers the entirety of the figurine. Just like on the rocks, this figurine features a lot of lining in the light areas and in the shadow areas. And once again, these nail art brushes really came in clutch for this step. They made it so much easier to get these nice, thin, clean lines. I cannot recommend enough that you get your own. Now that the body is pretty much completely painted, we can move on to the details. Starting off with his little head fin, as well as his little head cap marking thing. I don't know how to call it, but the thing on top of his head. And yet again, I start off with doing the shadows and then move on to the lights. I did use a graphite pencil first to outline every detail on his head so that they would be as accurate as possible. That includes the little cap of his head and the eyes. I don't bother just yet with marking out the details of the eyes because I will go back over it with paint. And of course, we can't forget the satisfying lining yet again. Moving on to the eyes, I carefully mark out the scleras with white paint. During this step, I often flip the figurine back and forth to check for the evenness of the eyes. Using a light blue paint, I mark out the shadows in the scleras. Then, using the reddest, brightest paint I own, I carefully and slowly mark out his iris. Then, I simply add layers of lighter and lighter shades of pink on the eyes to mimic light. We are officially down to the last little details, starting off with this cute little scarf. Okay, to be fair, I don't know if it's a scarf, but I think it kind of looks like a scarf, so I'm gonna call it a scarf. Either way, I painted it with a very similar green to the moss we used earlier. And then I simply added the little shadows with a slightly darker green. Last little detail before we can start lining the figurine, and those are his little tusk thingies. Once again, I used my thinnest and most precise brushes for this process. Now, this isn't a sponsored segment, I'm not getting paid to say this, but Warpaints' black paint is really good. It is sleek, it flows well, and it dries quickly. If you are on the market for a black paint, I would recommend Warpaints immediately. This is the last line that I need to pull, and then we're going to be able to add the cute little eye shines. Now I can finally clean my palette and show you guys the final result. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. I'm grateful for that. And if you like my content and you want to see more, don't forget to maybe subscribe and drop a like if you want to help me keep making these videos. You can also go follow me on my social media on Instagram at Luvia_creations. I can't wait to see you guys in the next video, and as always, is it cute?